Kalispera from Athens, Kalimera in the US, or good afternoon in the United States. Welcome and thank you for joining us for yet another presentation of CYA's virtual lecture series. I'm glad to be able to do this today. We had a bit of a scare. We normally broadcast from CYA's academic center, but 2 hours ago, the provider of CYA, Vodafone, and the provider of most of Greece went on the blink. Apparently, an underwater cable between Italy, Greece, I think Bulgaria, and Turkey was cut by accident. So there is no Vodafone service in these countries right now. So we took refuge at the house of our academic director, Theonis Kouta, and with a lot of Greek ingenuity and the help of our very good technician, IT man, Thanasis Karnavezos, and of course, Billy Simopoulos, who is orchestrating this whole thing, we are managing to broadcast today. As you know by now, CYA's virtual lecture series is a forum of exchanging thoughts in a virtual environment and a podium in which people related to CYA and active in our community can share their experiences with the broader public. We have been very fortunate so far to have had people in this series who are indeed experts in their fields, whether that is in the humanities or the social sciences or the natural and formal sciences. And these people are all affiliated with CYA in one form or another, either as former students, alumni, or as board members and trustee emeriti, or former and or current faculty members. CYA is very proud of its community. This week, we are privileged to have as our guest speaker a member of CYA's Board of Trustees, who is also an alumnus, and as a discussant, an alumnus of CYA as well. Both speaker and discussant attended CYA at the same year. They were in the class of 1983 and are considered experts in their fields, conducting pioneer work in neurotechnology and neurophysiology. Our guest speaker is Nicholas Hatsopoulos, and our discussant is John Pezaris, or I guess Pezaris in the US. Dr. Nicholas Hatsopoulos, Nicho, aside from being a CYA trustee and a former professor at college here in Athens, because he taught a course at CYA last year, is currently a professor of neurology and professor of organismal biology and anatomy at the University of Chicago. Nicho completed his BA in physics at Williams College in 1984, his Master of Science in Psychology in 1991, and his PhD in Cognitive Science from Brown University in 1992. He has completed 2 postdoctoral research fellowships, and one in the Department of Neuroscience at Brown, and the other in the Computational Neuroscience program at the California Institute of Technology. In 2001, he co-founded a company, Cyberkinetics Neurotechnology Systems, which involved the basic scientific research he and his colleagues conducted to develop neural prosthesis technology to assist people with severe motor disabilities. His research focuses on the neural basis of motor control and learning. He investigates what features of motor behavior are encoded and what this information is represented in the collective activity of neuronal ensembles in the motor cortex. I hope his talk will be easier to comprehend than what I just said to you. He's currently running a laboratory at the University of Chicago with graduate students postdoctoral fellows, and technicians, funded in part by the National Institute of Health. Oh, I must not forget one more thing about Nicho. I'm very proud to be his uncle. Today, Nicho will go over a brief history of ancient Greeks' contribution to neuroscience, followed by recent developments in brain-machine interfaces. He will discuss how we connect the brain with machines to help patients with severe motor disabilities. His topic is connecting the brain to machines, from the Pre-Socratics to Elon Musk. Facilitating the discussion will be CYA alumnus John Pezaris. John is an assistant in neurosurgery at the Massachusetts General Hospital and an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. He has a background in computer science and electrical engineering with bachelor's and master's degrees from MIT, wow, and in neurophysiology with a PhD from California Institute of Technology and postdoctoral experience at the Harvard Medical School. He currently runs the Visual Prosthesis Laboratory at Mass General, where his team uncovers the secrets of the visual system in order to restore sight to the blind. We're glad to have both of them as part of our series today. As usual, before I pass the floor to John, may I remind you all that this is being recorded for posterity and for the pleasure of others who could not be with us today. Those of you who might not want to be recorded, please switch off your video cameras. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexei. As you mentioned, I will be helping to facilitate the procedures for today's virtual lecture series. Nicho and I have known each other for our entire lives. I want to check, is the feed switching correctly? Nicho and I have known each other for our entire lives. We've grown up together. We have had a shared childhood. In fact, our mothers knew each other in high school in Athens. And not only have we had our personal lives intertwined in that way, we have had our professional lives intertwined as well. We both came to neuroscience, albeit from different paths, but we study the same question, that is, how do you get the outside world, computers, to connect to the brain and either read information from the brain to be able to affect the outside world, or deliver information to the brain in order to have the outside world interact with the brain. Now, when we say machine-brain interfaces, we're really talking about computers, but these computers in Nicho's laboratory in particular have mechanical devices attached to them, where someone who is paralyzed and otherwise unable to move can think about moving their arm, have Nicho's devices read that activity in the neurons of their cortex, and move a robot as if that person was moving their arm. This is the stuff of science fiction, and it leads to questions about the nature of reality and in our interaction with reality that Nicho will be addressing today as he looks back to the origins of neuroscience in ancient Greece with the Pre-Socratics and draws a line from them to the current exciting work that's done in his laboratory, as well as funding projects that are funded by Elon Musk. Now, before I give the floor over to Nicho, there are some administrative details I need to address. Throughout this discussion, you can submit your questions through the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can send them either directly to me or to everyone. And as soon as Nicho concludes his presentation, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. If you are watching on Facebook Live, you may also submit your questions using the comment section, and those will be relayed to me, and we'll get to those as well. As a reminder, we are recording this. this lecture, and in a couple of days, the people who have registered will be receiving a link to view that recording. And I would now like to pass the floor on to Nicho for his presentation entitled Connecting the Brain to Machines, from the Pre-Socratics to Elon Musk. Nicho, to you.
Thank you, John. I want to thank, that's a wonderful introduction. That saves me some time to avoiding reintroducing the subject. I want to thank Alexei for inviting me, and Vasilis for helping with the logistics of this lecture series. I want to give a shout out to some of the teachers that it seems like yesterday that John and I were at CYA, and I just wanted to give a shout out to some of the great teachers we had at CYA. People like Steve Diamond, who still teaches there, the late Robert Lane, Marinetta Papahimona, who's still teaching, and of course John Camp, who I still remember those lectures on the Acropolis in the cold mornings, and then going for brandy afterwards. It was really a wonderful experience. And also want to thank all the new friends I met, teachers and staff, when I taught for my sabbatical last fall. So let me move on to my presentation. All right, so I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing connecting the brain to machines. Terms have been, John has already mentioned some terms, and Alexei, and these terms are interchangeable. You can use the word brain-machine interface, you can use the word brain-computer interface, or in the more clinical realm, you can use the word neural prosthesis. And for me, they're all the same thing. And our goals, and the goals of John and others in the general field of neuroprostheses, is to help people with with disabilities, either on the sensory side or on the motor side. Now, there's this guy that probably most of you know right here, Elon Musk, who's been in the news lately with his amazing rocket company, his electric cars. But many of you may not know that he has also founded a company called Neuralink. And this is a company that is trying to develop and commercialize brain-machine interfaces. But his goal is a little more sort of ambitious and perhaps ethically questionable, which is to develop brain-machine interfaces to help the larger community of humans interact with computers, thereby competing with what he considers the biggest challenge we faced and fear we face today, which is the development of artificial intelligence. And he thinks that artificial intelligence will make us look like just house cats. I think that's the term he uses. So basically we'll be like kind of stupid beings compared to AI. And so the only way for us to compete with AI is to merge with machines. So that's his ultimate goal. Whether he'll get to that, I don't know. He does have a lot of money, which helps. But that's where we're at right now. We have basic scientists, engineers in academic centers, as well as people in industry trying to develop these systems for helping patients, as well as for these broader goals. But before I continue, I just wanted to give you a brief detour on the Greek origins of neuroscience, because I think it's very revealing. And it actually has some bearing on the fields that I do and John does. So in ancient times, for example, at the time of Aristotle, most civilizations believed that the seat of the mind was the heart, and Aristotle was no different. It is a little strange that Aristotle, who's considered perhaps the founder of empirical science, actually had it wrong. And what's even more interesting is that he was spent many years at the Plato's Academy in Athens, and Plato actually believed that the brain was the seat of the mind. But nevertheless, Aristotle believed otherwise. He thought the heart was. And his view was that the brain is a radiator. So he believed that the heart was the seat of sensation and movement, and the heart created, among other things, a lot of heat, which had to be dissipated. And the brain acted as that dissipator of heat. As I said, many civilizations at the time also believed the heart was the seat of the mind, including the Egyptians, the Persians, even the Chinese. Now, to be fair to Aristotle, he really considered the heart and the brain as a system that worked together, and they were very intimately connected, and they were both very important in the functioning of the human. And the other thing you should note is that Aristotle never really localized. He localized sensation to the heart, but he didn't localize other psychological faculties such as reasoning and imagining and memory to the heart. But rather, he said it really was it resided throughout the whole organism, and that's actually kind of an interesting thought, because there's a prevailing theory in modern psychology called embodied cognition, which argues that cognition depends not just on the brain, but on the brain in a body. So he may have had some interesting insights that were only rediscovered centuries later. The other thing Aristotle noted, which was true, which was correct, but for the wrong reasons, which was that the brain was very large in man, in humans, relative to body mass. And that's what contributed to their intelligence. So that's actually true. That's what most people believe. But the reasoning was wrong. He thought, well, because we're so intelligent, we need a bigger heart and we're creating more heat. Therefore, we need a bigger radiator to radiate all that heat. So he had some parts of it right and some parts of it wrong. Now, before Aristotle, interestingly, the Pre-Socratics, in particular Alcmaeon of the Croton school and Hippocrates, actually believed the seat of the mind was the brain and not the heart. So Alcmaeon resided in what's now modern day Italy, in a little town called Crotone, which I've heard from my Italian friends is not a very nice place, but he was living in what was at the time Magna Graecia, a colony of ancient Greece. And he first declared the idea that the brain was the seat of perception. His focus was on perception per se, that is sensory perception. Hippocrates expressed this more generally and said that the brain was the source of our pleasure, our laughter, our grief, and many other faculties, psychological faculties. So both of these schools, pre-Socratic schools, believed that the seat of the mind and perception was the brain. Now, interestingly, it was only during the Roman period that Galen, another Greek philosopher scientist, where people sort of the modern day view of neuroscience emerged. He was a very well-skilled neuroanatomist, and he was the one who first identified many of the cranial nerves in the body. And he did something very interesting. He did perhaps the first neuroscientific experiment where he severed the laryngeal nerve of a pig and noticed that the pig stopped squealing. So that idea of actually interfering with the nervous system and creating a disruption is the basis of many experiments that happen even to this day. Now, he did have other thoughts. he viewed the ventricles, which are those open spaces in the brain where cerebrospinal fluid exists. He viewed those as the site of the psychic pneuma or spirit, and the solid part of the brain was the site of the soul. Now, these concepts of pneuma and soul are not concepts that we use today, at least in neuroscience, but nevertheless, he was perhaps the father of neuroscience as we understand it today. Okay, so before I go on to what we're doing right now in the lab, I just wanted to say one more thing, which is CYA's connection to neuroscience. You might say, well, what sort of connection would CYA have? After all, its focus is on the classics primarily and on social science. Well, it turns out the founder is Mini Philippopoulos and her partner, George Philippopoulos, were both had both studied fields that form the basis for neuroscience. And I have an old picture right here, which pictured here is Mini, who was the founder, and she was trained as a biologist. And George Philippopoulos was trained as a psychologist, which are really the two fields or branches of science that form the basis of neuroscience. Now, that guy on the left, that sexy guy on the left, is, as many of you know, probably know, is our president, CYA, Alexei Philippopoulos, during his hippie days. And that little kid between Ismini and George is me when I was 10 years old. And we're sitting there about to eat some food at a taverna by the sea. So you can see that CYA really has at its foundation a connection with neuroscience. So brain-machine interfaces, as I said, well, neuroscience in general had its roots in the Pre-Socratics, including Alcmaeon. And much of Alcmaeon's writings, in fact, almost all of it has been destroyed. So we have none of his original writings, but other people, including students of Aristotle, quoted from Alcmaeon's writings. And one thing what's very interesting is Alcmaeon is quoted as saying, "The eye obviously has fire within, for when one is struck, this fire flashes out." Now, what did he mean by that? Well, it turns out he probably had an incorrect view that the way we see is by shining light out from our eyes. But he had another idea, which is actually very true, which is this notion of pressure phosphenes. If you press on your eyeball right now, you'll see a little spot of light on the back of your retina on the opposite side. That spot of light is caused by mechanically pressing on your eyeball. And this notion of phosphene is just a spot of light, is the basis for modern day visual prosthesis, such as the work that John Pezaris is doing. But now, of course, instead of putting pressure on the eyeball, John is electrically stimulating part of the brain to create these phosphenes or spots of light. So you could maybe argue that Alcmaeon is the father of brain-machine interfaces, because he had this notion that one could connect the outside world with the brain through this mechanical interface. So the most successful brain-machine interface to date is the cochlear implant. This is helping people who are deaf, profoundly deaf, due to inner ear problems. And the way it works is you have a microphone that takes in sound, and that's then translated into a set of impulses, which lead to electrodes that stimulate the cochlea, which is in the inner ear. And so you basically have a set of electrical impulses that then travel up the nerve, the auditory nerve, and result in some form of hearing. And it's been extremely successful. There have been thousands of implants done worldwide. People with cochlear implants can hear, meaning they can understand speech. They have what's called functional hearing. They do not hear the way we do. And in fact, they don't appreciate some of the subtleties we appreciate, such as music. But nevertheless, it's been a real breakthrough. And this is our ultimate goal in our field. In John's field and my field is, can we get a system like the cochlear implant that really helps people and is widely adopted? Now, as I already mentioned, John Pezaris and others in the field of visual prosthetics are developing systems where you apply electrical stimulation to different parts of the visual pathway. And right here, this is a rendering of how the system might work in John's case. So you have eyeglasses with cameras embedded in them, and those signals, electrical signals from the cameras, get delivered to a set of electrodes after some signal processing to a set of electrodes that are implanted in different parts of the brain. In the case of John, it's in the thalamus. Other people are targeting the cortex. There are many different places you could target these electrical stimulators. But the idea is you're going to create these phosphenes, these spots of light, with enough electrodes to get a visual image. So to help the profoundly blind. So it's really exciting work that is, again, it's not at the stage of the cochlear implant, but it's getting there. Now, what I'm trying to do is a little bit different. In contrast to the cochlear implant and the visual prostheses, instead of delivering signals into the brain, we're trying to read out signals from the brain. So pictured here are the four major components. You've got an electrode array pictured there next to my fingertip to give you a sense of the scale. And those electrodes now are not stimulating electrically the brain, but are recording signals from individual neurons in the brain. And though that panel to the right of that image is just a series of these impulses that are emitted by individual neurons. So those impulses, and each row is a different neuron. So basically that's what's happening right now as you're listening to me. You've got millions of neurons in your brain right now sending out these impulses to other neurons. And what our goal is to try to understand the language of the brain. What are those trains of impulses? What do they mean in terms of the human, in terms of their thoughts? And in particular, in our case, their thoughts with regard to movement. Can we decode these signals like Alan Turing did during World War II, where he decoded the German Enigma code and was able to understand what the Germans were communicating? Well, that's what we're trying to do right now in the brain through a decoding algorithm. So it's basically a computer program that takes those sets of impulses and translates that into something useful, such as the position of your arm, or the velocity of your arm, or the forces you're applying by your arm or hand. Once we've got that decoded signal, we then send it to an output device, and that could be a prosthetic limb, it could be an autonomous robot, it could be a computer cursor on a screen, many different things. And then the fourth component is sensory feedback, because as you probably all know, when you move in space, you're not blind, first of all. You're using your vision to guide your movements. And you're also using other senses, such as touch and kinesthesis. You know where your limbs are in space. You can feel your limbs in space, and that helps you guide them. So as of a few years ago, the state of the art in this field is pictured right here. So this is a study that came out of the University of Pittsburgh in a patient with spinal cord injury. An array of electrodes was implanted in the motor cortex of this subject. And then he was trained to think about moving this robot arm, leading to his ability to move, to grab that object, move it in space, and place it on that tray. This is an incredible breakthrough, because the subject was able to control 7 degrees of freedom of the robot. That is 7 joints. So both, where it was going in space, but also the orientation of the wrist, as well as grasping movements. So he's able to control 7 dimensions and was able to do this. Incredible breakthrough. So you might say, well, okay, we're done. What's there else to solve, right? We've solved the problem. Why don't we now develop these systems into commercial products? Well, the problem is that, first of all, these videos have been selected to show like best, very good performance. They're not always that good. And you also notice performance is kind of slow, not particularly coordinated. So what else do we need to do to improve these systems? Well, one thing that we've been tackling right now is to augment these systems with touch. Imagine a subject, when he was grabbing those objects with a robot, could actually feel the objects. Now, touch is really important, particularly when you're manipulating objects. Because when you grab an object like your cup of coffee, you can't rely on vision to decide how much force to place on your cup of coffee, because vision is not going to help you, right? It's not going to help you and prevent you from crushing the cup or letting it go and letting it fall on the floor. So you need to rely on touch, and the motor system depends on touch to guide object manipulation. This is just a demonstration of the importance of touch. This is a subject that's trying to light a match on the left, and on the right, she's doing the same thing, but this time her fingertips have been anesthetized with a local anesthetic. And you'll notice she's having a really hard time picking up the match. She's got vision, but notice how she just really struggles. She manages in the end, but she's really struggling to hold the match properly, and she finally gets it, right? But you can see how the touch is really important. So how are we trying to solve this problem? Well, we have a team now at the University of Chicago, led by Suleiman Benzmea, Peter Warnke, John Downey, and Ray Lee, where we're going to try to, in human subjects, provide not only motor control from signals coming from the motor cortex, but also deliver artificial touch to the subject by electrically stimulating a part of the brain called the somatosensory cortex. And down on the left, lower left, you'll see the little red area or pink area is where the motor cortex is. And right behind it in the green area is the somatosensory cortex. And it's been known now for, wow, it's probably almost 100 years, maybe a little less than that if you electrically stimulate that green area, you'll get percepts, you'll get touch percepts. And depending on where you go along that strip of green, you'll get a feeling of somebody touching your thumb, your index finger, and so forth, and your arm, and your legs, and so forth. So that's what we're trying to do. And together with the University of Pittsburgh, we have this joint project. And in about little over 3 weeks from now, we're going to do our first human patient at the University of Chicago with a system that both records from motor cortex to control a robot and provides electric feedback, touch feedback through electrical stimulation of the somatosensory cortex. Now, this experiment in a human was done before we're doing it now in Chicago. It was done in Pittsburgh. And I want to show you what the subject reports when the robotic hand is touched. So I'm going to show you this video right now. Oh no, actually, before I get to that, let me just show you what we're talking about. This is basically showing how natural touch works. When you're touching an object, sensors in the fingertips pick up that mechanical deformation of the skin, leading to these impulses that travel up the nerves and ultimately land in the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so what we're trying to do instead is use a robotic limb robotic device with sensors on the fingertips, and then electrically send those signals up to a set of electrodes that are implanted in the somatosensory cortex, and then delivering electrical stimulation to create that artificial touch. So this is what the subject reports.
I'm good.
Okay, here we go again.
Index, ring, pinky, index, middle, 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 ring, ring, index, index, ring.
So you get the point there. The subject senses, understands what finger is being touched, and the way, and by touching this robotic hand. Now, you might ask, but what is the actual perceptual experience the subject is having? Well, it's actually not perfectly natural. And depending on the parameters of stimulation, you sometimes get a kind of a almost like a vibratory feel to it. Sometimes it's a sharp feeling of touch. There are many different words the subject uses, but when we ask him, is it natural? Does it feel like you're really being touched? He doesn't say it's quite natural. Something weird about it. And that's one of our aims in this project, is to try to adjust these parameters of stimulation to make it more natural. And the reason we want to do that, at least for me, is not so that he has a pleasurable experience. I mean, that's kind of a byproduct. What our primary goal is to, by providing natural feeling that will allow the subject better motor control. And I'm going to finish up with this one video to show you how the introduction of sensory feedback through this artificial means allows for better motor control. So the next video is going to have two videos side by side. On the left, you'll see the subject controlling the robotic arm and hand with electrical stimulation to the somatosensory cortex. So he actually is feeling something. And on the right, where we turn off the stimulator, okay? So on the left, you can see he's actually doing a better job of manipulating the object and bringing it up to the tray. Whereas on the right, he's sort of fumbling a bit. And that's not surprising, right? Because the subject doesn't feel anything. He's only seeing what he's doing. He doesn't feel anything on the right. So you get the idea. That's what we're after in our next implant at Chicago. But we want to go step further. We want to make the sensation more natural, and we also want to create better decoding algorithms. That is how we translate motor cortical activity into force signals to allow the subject to apply different amounts of force to objects. And it will allow for better object manipulation. So we're going to improve both the motor end of it and the sensory end in our subject in Chicago. And then in the longer term, what I'm particularly interested in is replacing the robotic arm with an exoskeletal robot. So instead of having the human subject control a disembodied arm, what if you could do the same thing as we're doing right now, but have this human subject wear a robot which moves his natural limb and hand? And that, I think that could be a very, a device that could actually be very useful to the subject at home to do, everyday activities. So that's our longer term goal. So I think I'll stop right there. This is my lab at the University of Chicago, and I will take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicho, for that very interesting talk. I would now like to get into some questions. As a reminder, type them into the Zoom group chat that you can get to at the bottom of your screen. And if you're on Facebook Live, you can send them to us and they will be relayed as well. As people are typing in their questions, I have a few that I'd like to ask Nicho.
Sure.
On that last video that you showed us, it looked like the addition of somatosensory feedback made the picking up task a lot faster. Is that always the case?
In those experiments, yes, but I think, remember the sensors are only on the fingertips. So where the speed advantage occurs is once the object is being touched and manipulated. So are you talking about the speed of the arm reaching the object?
Or the speed of the task as a whole, picking it up and dropping it over onto the
Absolutely.
other location?
It was much faster due to the fact that he wasn't fumbling with the object as much.
Did you ever try providing incorrect information under those circumstances to see if it would take some time for them to adapt to it?
Yes, that's a really good question. And I don't believe that was done, but that's something we might want to try in our experiment in Chicago. Change things such that the thumb is actually, when the thumb of the robot is touched, he actually feels it in his pinky or something like that, right? That would,
yeah, exactly.
I think, again, I believe that the subject would learn with practice to use that information and could probably get as good as he did with just stimulating in the normal way, but it would take some practice.
Let me ask one more question before I get to some of the questions that are coming in. How much practice does it take, given how long does it take a subject to get to the ability that we saw in that video just now?
Okay, well, that's a really good point. So, and it hinges on the fact that we're trying to develop what's called a biomimetic decoder. So something that feels very natural. And so the subject requires almost no training. It's almost immediate. I don't remember how many days after the subject was first experimented, was first implanted, that this experiment was videotaped, but there's almost no training required. And we found the same thing in our monkey experiments. Our monkeys learned to control devices immediately and did not require any training if we use this approach, this sort of naturalistic approach to both decoding and stimulation.
And now we have a question from Elaine Rigas, who says, how far off are you from taking something like this to market? When can we see this as a clinical device?
Oh boy. Every time I get that question, now I've gotten that question for about 20 years, and I say, oh, in about 5 years. And so I keep on saying 5 years and 5 years and 5 years. And I think the problem is, I had a little experience with creating a company in this field, and it was successful scientifically in that we showed that a human subject who was paralyzed, even a patient with ALS, for example, could control a device, but commercially it was not successful. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, this takes a lot of money and a lot of resources to get going. And secondly, the market size is small, which is unfortunate. The market size, for spinal cord injury with tetraplegia is only about, on the order of several 100,000 people have this condition in the United States. So it's relatively small. So a company doesn't have the motive to get into it. And so I think where it might lead to, what would the impetus that would lead to maybe a commercial device is either by having the government work together with private corporations. For example, we got funding from the Department of Defense, who was trying to help patients, soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with missing limbs. And so they wanted to invest a lot of money to help these soldiers with prosthetic limbs that were controlled from the brain. So some sort of private-public partnership would be one way to solve that. The other is Elon Musk's vision, which is, well, first of all, he has a lot of money. And secondly, his vision is to use this system more broadly in the general public. If you could develop a system that is maybe less invasive than our systems, many people could use it, not just spinal cord injured patients. So I don't know. So the answer to your question is, I have no idea. I could say 5 years and, it just might, I'll be lying to you probably.
So we have a handful of questions that all seem to address the same kind of issue, and it's a question of approach and technique. We have a question about biocompatibility of electrodes, and that being a major challenge, and whether you would consider other approaches that, for example, would use optogenetics, or instead of going into the brain, tapping into the nerves peripherally rather than centrally.
Yes. So, okay. So biocompatibility, that's the first thing. So yes, that is an important point, which the current technology we're using that's FDA approved for these trials, not for commercial use, but for these clinical trials, do have issues with longevity. Some of them last for years. Some of the implants don't last for years. And so then they have to be removed and reimplanted with a new device. So there's a number of groups that are trying to develop more biocompatible electrodes, especially ones that are more flexible, that match the flexibility or the what do you call it? The elasticity of the brain. Now the other point was optogenetics. Optogenetics is the idea that you can use light to stimulate the brain. That potential, it's never been done in humans, to my knowledge. I may be wrong about that. And the way that works is you have to inject a virus into the brain, which a harmless virus, which then expresses light-sensitive receptors that then when you shine light, these cells start firing. And I'm not sure if for ethical reasons or safety reasons that is in the cards in the near future. Maybe it will be. I mean, the viruses that we use in optogenetics is in animals are harmless for the most part. And then, but that's a question. And the third, what was the other point about?
Whether you would consider going to a peripheral target rather than a
yeah. So a number of people are doing that right now. A lot of people, especially with amputees, they're targeting the peripheral nerves, and they're very successful. Now, that's not going to help you with a spinal cord injured patient. Because,
and is your focus primarily on amputees or primarily on spinal cord injury patients?
Well, our focus is on spinal cord injury. So in that case, the nerve is not going to help you because the nerve is beyond the injury. So you can't use the nerve anymore.
We have an interesting question. It opens up a huge can of worms. How do you figure out the algorithms to do your decoding?
Very interesting. What we do, and this was actually work that my lab did in monkeys first, and then first documented that this could work. Although other groups had also done similar things. But basically, what we do is we show them a video of something moving, like a rendering of an arm moving in space on a video on a computer screen, and we tell the subject, imagine you're moving this thing. Now, this thing isn't being controlled by the human subject. He's just seeing this hand and arm moving in space, and we say, just imagine you're moving it. You're moving your own arm. And it turns out when you do that, cells in the motor cortex will fire in almost the same way as if the human subject was moving their own arm. And once we now evoke these responses in the motor cortex, when he's watching a rendering of the arm or hand on the screen, we then create a mapping between the brain activity and the motion of this hand and arm on the screen. Once we've got that mapping, that decoder, then we give it to the human subject to control a robotic arm.
And that decoder is going to depend on exactly where the electrodes are placed, or is it an individual variation? How consistent is it from one person to the next, or one implant to the next?
Okay, so there's no consistency across subject. So you have to build a new decoder for every subject. But fortunately, in the motor cortex, it doesn't matter very much where you implant the array in the motor cortex. You can have a lot of slop, it'll still work. On the somatosensory side, on the other hand, it doesn't. You really have to put electrodes in the right spot, like in the thumb area, to get sensation of the thumb. But as far as moving the thumb, you can put it in many different areas of the motor cortex, and these cells will fire when the subject thinks about moving their thumb.
And then we have a couple of questions that are related to exoskeletons. The first is, what are the benefits of an exoskeleton versus a simple prosthesis, a single arm prosthesis or a single leg prosthesis? And related to that, how does the ReWalk robotic exoskeleton work for those with spinal cord injuries? I'm not familiar with a ReWalk exoskeleton, perhaps you are.
Okay, so, well, the second question, I don't know much about. That's a lower limb exoskeleton. I don't really, there's work being done in lower limbs, prostheses, and including exoskeletons. I'm not very familiar with that, so I can't address that. As far as exoskeletons in general, the reason exoskeletons are exciting to me are twofold. First of all, if you've got a paralyzed person, wouldn't they rather control their own arm than a third arm? And secondly, and this is very important, many spinal cord injured patients have some residual sensation, both touch and kinesthesis. And so you can take advantage of that residual sensation with the exoskeleton. So as they move the exoskeleton, they're moving their own arm, right? And they can touch things with their own fingertips. They can feel the arm moving in space because they have this residual kinesthesis. So we've done some experiments with that, with an exoskeleton, with a monkey, and we found that using an exoskeleton gives him better control because he can feel where the robot is moving in space.
And let's have the last question now. Might this research be something that could help children with traumatic brain injury someday?
Yes, in principle, depending on the kind of injury. One great thing about motor control is that it's, and especially at the cortical level, is signals related to controlling things, movements of the limbs, are highly distributed throughout the cortex. So if you have an injury to one area of the brain, let's say the motor cortex, you can use another part of the brain to some degree. It may not work quite as well, but there is some sort of distributed processing. So if you've lost this one area of the motor cortex, you still can rely on other areas to take over.
And that's fascinating, because it's in direct contradiction to what we find in the visual system, or at least in the early visual system, where the hardwired expectations of the brain are really difficult to overcome. And for our research, it's really critical to try and mimic exactly what the brain expects to see, as opposed to what you've just said, where in higher order areas, it's more flexible and more adaptable.
Yeah.
Well, with that, Nicho, thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for your interesting questions. And I would like now to pass the platform back over to Alexei, for his concluding remarks. Alexei, to you.
Well, yeah, that was a fascinating talk. Thank you both. Really fascinating. And what's very interesting is that we're used to seeing alumni of CYA as professors of subjects connected to Hellenism, classical studies mostly. Well, today we saw the two of you experts in neuroscience, and that gives a whole new dimension to what CYA can do. We are so glad you're doing all this good work for the good of humanity, really. Let me just say that we are hoping to have as our next speaker on October 21st at the same time, CYA Professor Angeliki Dimitriadi, head of the migration program at ELIAMEP, which is the foreign policy think tank in Athens, who will talk about migration and irregular border crossings in contemporary times, which is most prevalent in Greece nowadays and all the way back to God knows when, and very common, of course, in other countries, including the US and Mexico and so on. So it's a fascinating subject, and she's going to confirm that she can do it today, so we'll let you know. It strikes me that having seen that photograph that Nicho showed, which claimed that the founders of CYA had something to do with neuroscience, because one was a biologist and the other one was a psychologist. Well, it strikes me also that Dimitriadi is going to talk about migration, and both the biologist and the psychologist were both refugees in this country. So with this note, I want to say goodbye to all of you, and stay well, stay safe, and we'll hope to see you in our next lecture. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.